under the scorching heat of the desert noon. The giant expeditionary army of the Western Empire moved slowly, like a giant snake made of iron, slithering on the vast sea of sand. 20,000 heavy infantry, wearing thick armor and carrying large rectangular shields, were struggling with the first enemy, the harsh nature. Heat rising from the ground blurred the vision, turning distant sand dunes into flickering, ghostly illusions. The clanking sound of metal colliding, mixed with the heavy breathing of tens of thousands of people, created a dull, monotonous sound, lasting for many days of non-stop marching. The commanding generals rode horses in the middle of the formation, their faces hardened with worry. 3 days had passed since they crossed the border river. Carried water supplies were running low, but the enemy's shadow was completely nowhere to be seen. Light cavalry scout squads sent to explore the front and flanks since early morning still saw no one returning to report. The silence of the desert did not bring a sense of peace, but on the contrary, it evoked extreme insecurity, as if the desert was holding its breath, waiting for a storm to hit. Suddenly, from the eastern horizon, a cloud of opaque yellow dust began to rise, obscuring even the harsh sunlight. Not a natural sandstorm. The ground beneath the feet of tens of thousands of soldiers began to shake slightly. Initially, just vague vibrations, but quickly becoming distinct. That is the sound of horse hooves, not of a few hundred, but of thousands of war horses galloping at the same time. The sound of alarm horns tore through the quiet space. The commanders of the Western Empire screamed orders. Signal flags waved wildly in the dust.
Stop! Form ranks! Prepare to engage!
The shouts transmitted along the long line of troops. Infantry hurriedly lowered their center of gravity, crowding the formation close together. Large shields were erected into a steel wall, long spears protruding out like porcupine quills. Meanwhile, the distant dust cloud had rushed near. From within that misty sand screen, the first black shadows appeared. Those were the cavalry of the Eastern Kingdom, wearing loose silk robes over light armor, heads wrapped in scarves covering faces, revealing only cold, sharp eyes. They did not rush straight into the Western infantry formation, but split into 2 giant wings, running around and surrounding the huddled army. The rapid sound of battle drums, the wild screaming of thousands of cavalry echoed all around, turning the empty desert into a death arena, where 20,000 Western troops were completely inside the closed encirclement. 5,000 cavalry of the Eastern Kingdom had no intention of stopping or rushing into melee combat. Instead, they moved continuously in a giant circle surrounding the Western army block. Horse hooves kicked up blinding dust, limiting the infantry's vision to only a few steps. These step riders controlled their horses skillfully with their knees, 2 hands free, raising large horn bows, a specific type of weapon with terrible tension. A shrill whistle sounded, tearing through the thunder of horse hooves. Immediately, thousands of bowstrings snapped simultaneously, creating a chilling sound like the harp of death. The blue sky above the desert suddenly darkened by a thick black cloud, consisting of tens of thousands of arrows launched high, drawing deadly rainbow lines, then rushing straight down at the huddled formation below.
Raise shields! Cover!
The screams of the Western infantry commanders were lost in the whistling wind. Soldiers in the front row knelt down, planting shield edges firmly into the hot sand. The rear ranks simultaneously raised shields high above their heads, this shield edge overlapping that shield edge, creating a solid roof of wood covered in leather and iron, covering the entire formation. In just a split second, the 20,000-man block turned into a closed, mobile fortress, dark and sullen amidst the sea of sand. The first arrows hitting the target created a series of popping sounds like hail pouring on a roof. Most arrows stuck into the wooden face of the shields, vibrating violently. However, the power of the composite bows from the east far exceeded the estimations of Western generals. At the tiny gaps between the shields, or at positions where soldiers carelessly lowered their hands due to fatigue, arrows pierced through the gaps, sticking into the shoulders, necks, and thighs of the unfortunate soldiers. Meanwhile, at the corners of the square formation, the situation became most tense. The Eastern Horse Archer Squad continuously changed movement trajectories. They galloped dangerously close to the shield fence, then suddenly turned to shoot backward, a supreme archery technique making the opponent unable to judge the blocking direction. Arrows flew in a horizontal trajectory, slipping through the flanks and embedding straight into the poorly armored body parts of the perimeter troops. Blood began to dye the yellow sand red. The groans of those hit by arrows mixed with the angry growls of warriors tied to one spot. The Western infantry bloc, accustomed to glorious melee battles, now completely helpless. They were forced to stand still and endure the endless rain of arrows, sweat pouring out like a bath inside the stifling armor, eyes staring glaringly through the shield gap, waiting for an enemy they could not touch. The sun began to stand at its zenith, radiating stifling heat down onto the burning sand plain. Turning the space inside the iron armor sets into suffocating kilns. The patience of the Western Expeditionary Army was being worn away, bit by bit, not only because of the temperature, but also because of the cruel nature of the attack. Initially, the infantry commanders believed that the opponent would soon run out of arrows or get tired after a few waves of bombardment. But the reality on the battlefield unfolded completely the opposite. The arrows fired from the eastern hornbows were not ordinary arrows. They were heavier, with sharpened and slender tempered iron arrowheads, specifically designed to pierce armor. At close range, the terrible kinetic energy from the recurve bows turned these arrows into drills of death. The sound of cracking wood rang out dryly and continuously. The thick shields, once the pride of the Western infantry, began to be pierced. Many soldiers in the front row were horrified to realize the arrow had pierced through the oak layer, through the leather covering, and pinned their forearms tightly to the back of the shield. They could not let go of the shield, nor could they pull out the arrow, forcing them to grit their teeth and endure the 1,000-pound weight hanging on their bleeding arms. Some arrows flew with such force that they pierced through chest armor, pinning the soldier to the comrade standing right behind, creating horrific double injuries, causing the formation to fall into disarray. Unable to bear the scene of passive slaughter, a group of light infantry carrying javelins on the left flank, under the urging of the captains, recklessly broke ranks to rush up for a counterattack. They roared, trying to throw heavy javelins towards the enemy cavalry. But as soon as they left the protection of the shield wall, the Eastern cavalry immediately turned their horses, scattering far away like a broken hive of bees. The distance widened in a split second. The javelins of the Western troops fell and stuck into empty ground, tens of steps away from the target. Conversely, while galloping in retreat, the Eastern horse archers still looked back, firing back arrows with chilling accuracy. The counterattack army, overextended and exposed in the sun, immediately became living targets. One by one, they fell with chests and backs riddled with arrows. The few survivors had to throw away weapons and crawl back to the main ranks in despair, carrying the spreading terror throughout the entire army. The patience of the commander-in-chief of the Western Army finally ran out. When witnessing hundreds of soldiers falling every moment without causing any damage to the enemy, he ordered his son, a young, enthusiastic general, to lead a suicide squad to separate from the main formation to break the siege. The door of the giant phalanx block opened, and from there, a shock force of over 1,000 heavy cavalry, supported by 5,000 light infantry, spilling out like a broken dam flood. The attack horns of the Western army roared, carrying the anger suppressed since early morning. They spurred horses to full gallop, swords and spears drawn, rushing straight into the horse archers swarming around. Facing this fierce counterattack, the Eastern cavalry did not engage at all. They immediately turned their horses, whipped continuously, and fled south, creating an appearance of chaos, as if the ranks had broken before the overwhelming power of the opponent. Seeing the enemy flee, excitement and bloodlust blinded the Western generals. They forgot the principle of not separating from the main formation, trying hard to urge the troops to chase closely, creating a dense curtain completely separating the pursuing wing from the main army staying behind. The pursuit took place over a distance of nearly 5 miles. The more the Western troops chased, the more the Eastern troops ran, always keeping a distance, just enough not to be caught, but not too far to lose track. The Western soldiers, with heavy armor, began to get tired. The pursuit formation stretched out into a long, fragile string. Where the terrain dipped and was surrounded by towering sand dune. When the pursuing army had completely disappeared from the sight of the main army behind, the sound of the enemy's horse hooves suddenly changed rhythm. The fleeing Eastern horse archers suddenly spread out to the flanks and circled back, while from behind the high sand dunes, fresh elite troops, who had not fought since the beginning of the battle, loomed into appearance, blocking the retreat. The trap has snapped. In the low basin area, surrounded by towering sand dunes, the battlefield situation reversed brutally. The Eastern horse archers, who just recently pretended to flee in panic, now suddenly stopped, turned their horses, and spread out into a vast arc shape, sealing off every escape route. But the real nightmare for the Western pursuit wing only now officially appeared from behind the sand dunes. The heavy armored cavalry team, the most elite force of the Eastern Kingdom, completely different from the flexible archers wearing silk robes. These warriors, and even their war horses, were covered from head to toe in cold, glittering fish-scale iron armor. They did not carry bows, but gripped tightly in their hands oversized long spears, big and heavy to the extent that 2 hands must be used to control. Thousands of armored cavalry lined up horizontally, looming closer like a mobile iron city wall. The sound of horse hooves pounding the ground was significantly duller and heavier, shaking the ground beneath the feet of the exhausted Western soldiers. Finish them! The majestic attack horn sounded. The iron wall began to accelerate. The Western light cavalry, already tired and disordered after the long pursuit, tried to form a battle line to confront, but completely hopeless. The first collision created a horrifying sound of metal grinding against metal and the sound of bones shattering. The oversized long spears of the Eastern cavalry, with the momentum from the huge mass of both the armored person and horse, easily pierced through shields, punctured chest armor, and knocked Western knights off their horses. They were thrusts so powerful that they skewered 2 soldiers standing in line with each other. The pursuit formation shattered right in the first shockwave. Western infantry were squeezed into the middle, trampling on each other in panic. Thick dust obscured the sunlight, making them unable to distinguish directions, only seeing around them giant armored black shadows gliding past and deadly spear blades launching from all sides. Blood dyed the yellow sand dark, turning the basin into a deadly quagmire. The young commanding general tried to gather the last bodyguards to cut a bloody path to retreat, but that effort was quickly drowned in the sea of people and horses. A spear from an armored cavalryman hit his horse's flank, knocking the general down onto the sand. Before he could get up, dozens of spears were pointed at him, ending the life of the ambitious commander. His head was cut off, stuck on the longest spear, becoming a horrific trophy, signaling the complete destruction of the 6,000 pursuit troops. Meanwhile, at the encamped position of the massive Western army, the anxious waiting had reached its peak. Soldiers standing in the front row strained their eyes, looking towards the dust columns rising from afar, silently praying for the return of the pursuit wing. But their hope was extinguished and turned into extreme terror when the Eastern cavalry reappeared on the crest of the sand dunes. Leading that victorious army was a horseman raising a spear high, topped with the bloody severed head of the young general who just died in battle. That image was like a sledgehammer striking hard on the morale of the remaining 20,000 soldiers, signaling that the relief force had been completely wiped out. Not letting the opponent recover, the Eastern Army immediately switched to the total attack phase. This time, it was no longer arrows flying from afar. The heavy armored cavalry team, the iron monsters that just crushed the pursuit wing, began to line up horizontally, looming forward towards the wavering phalanx block. The ground shook violently under the weight of thousands of horses covered in fish-scale armor from head to toe. When the distance was only a few hundred steps, the steel cavalry group simultaneously lowered their oversized long spears, spurring horses to rush straight into the shield wall at lightning speed. The collision sound rang out like thunder exploding in the clear sky. The long and heavy spears, resonating with the momentum of both man and horse, slammed into the Western infantry's shield row with terrible destructive power. The leather-covered wooden shields, already damaged after hours of enduring arrow rain, now shattered like shards of pottery. The thrusting force pierced through the shield, pierced through the chest armor, knocking the first row of people backward. There were spear tips skewering 2-3 soldiers standing in a line, pinning them together into a bloody chain of human flesh. The solid square defense formation began to be dented, bumpy under the continuous butts of the iron cavalry. The Western infantry, already exhausted from the heat, thirst, and prolonged stress, now had to face mobile iron walls that their short swords could not reach. They tried to stab back at the horses' legs or armor gaps, but those weak efforts were quickly crushed. The Eastern cavalry, after the first thrust, did not stop at all. They controlled horses to trample over the fallen bodies, using the weight of war horses to break the formation structure, opening the way for the arrow storm from horse archers behind to continue pouring down into the deadly gaps just exposed. The last door of hope for the Western Army. The belief that the enemy would run out of ammunition after hours of bombardment completely collapsed before a cruel scene unfolding in the rear of the Eastern Army. From afar, looming in the dust screen, caravans of pack camels following each other endlessly were slowly entering the battlefield. On the backs of those calm beasts were not food or water, but bundles of arrows piled high like mountains. The Eastern horse archers took turns retreating to the rear, filling their quivers from this endless supply source, then immediately returning to the battle circle, continuing to pour a rain of death onto the opponent's head. The battlefield had now turned into a giant slaughterhouse, operating with terrifying efficiency. The Western formation was clamped tight between two unbreakable pincers of death. At close range, heavy armored cavalry used long spears to thrust, tossing shield layers, tearing apart the outer defense ranks. Meanwhile, at long range, Tens of thousands of arrows continuously poured into the center of the troop block, where soldiers were crowding each other to the point of having no room to raise their hands for cover. The chaos reached its peak as the space inside the encirclement increasingly narrowed. Wounded soldiers fell, but could not touch their backs to the ground because the troop density was too thick. They were stuck tight between standing comrades, dying slowly in an upright position or being trampled until breathing stopped. The strong smell of fresh blood rose, blending with the smell of sweat and sand dust, creating a suffocatingly stifling atmosphere. Large shields had now become useless, heavy because they were stuck full of arrows like porcupines. Many exhausted soldiers gave up, dropped weapons, and slumped down to the ground, waiting for death to come as a release from the heat and extreme fear. Western generals screamed hoarsely to maintain order, but their orders drowned in the roaring sound of horse hooves and the hiss of flying arrows. There was not any opportunity for counterattack, only passive endurance, and the attrition of vitality occurring every moment, every hour, under the cruel desert sun. Night finally fell, casting a thick black curtain over the bloody battlefield, bringing the bone-chilling cold characteristic of the desert, in complete contrast to the scorching heat of the day. Taking advantage of limited visibility and the temporary suspension of attacks by the Eastern Army, the surviving Western generals decided to execute a desperate retreat towards the nearest fortified citadel, a few miles away. However, this retreat quickly turned into a chaotic and tragic rout. Military discipline, the pride of the empire, had completely collapsed after a long day of slaughter. No more ranks, no more commands. Soldiers discarded heavy helmets and armor, threw away bags of gold coins and loot to run faster. Fear overrode all orders, turning the once mighty army block into panicked groups of people, trampling each other to find a way to live in the darkness. The greatest tragedy took place at the wounded assembly area. Thousands of wounded soldiers, those unable to move themselves, realized they were about to be left behind in the cold desert with a brutal enemy. Cries of lamentation and resentment rang out throughout the camp. They tried to crawl after, using bloody hands to grab the legs of comrades, grabbing the hems of the tunics of the healthy, begging not to be abandoned. But the fear of death had turned the able-bodied soldiers cruel. They brushed off those desperate hands, running headlong into the endless night. When the retreating army had just disappeared, the moans of those left behind gradually turned into screams of horror as the Eastern Army flooded in to control the camp. In the dim darkness, flickering torches illuminated the gruesome scene of the final massacre of those who could no longer resist. Meanwhile, the retreating group fumbled in the dark. Panic was so high that a small sound of sand wind or a distant horse neigh was enough to disturb the whole army. Trampling on each other, thinking the enemy had caught up. The cold and pale light of the dawn of the next day slowly illuminated a desolate scene stretching across the vast desert. Chaotic footprints overlapped each other. Dried black blood streaks and thousands of broken armor pieces, helmets thrown scattered on the sand, became the clearest roadmap for the pursuit army. The Eastern cavalry, after a night of rest and feeding horses to their fill, began to spread out to execute a large-scale hunt with the cruelty and precision of steppe wolf packs. No longer an organized battle, the desert now turned into a stage for small but bloody executions. The Western Army had completely disintegrated into small groups of a few people, or lost individuals, dragging steps aimlessly amidst the burning sea of sand. Burning thirst and physical exhaustion made them walk unsteadily like soulless corpses, hopeless, sunken eyes looking towards the blurry horizon. where there was not a shadow of any saving citadel. From behind, small dust clouds rose, signaling death was approaching. Eastern cavalry split into hundreds of small groups, each of a few dozen people, scouring every rock niche and sand dune crevice. When detecting a target, they did not rush to kill immediately, but often circled around the desperate prey. Arrows were fired with calculation, sticking into legs or shoulders, forcing the Western soldiers to fall to their knees on the hot sand, stripping away the last bit of resistance ability before the curved sword blade swung down to finish. In a few places, groups of Western soldiers gathered about a few hundred people, trying to form a circular formation to fight to the death on top of high sand dunes. But that effort only made them become clearer target practice boards amidst the blue sky. The Eastern cavalry did not need to approach. They simply stood from afar, pouring arrows into the huddled crowd until no one remained standing. Soldiers, once proud of the undefeated title, now fell piled up on each other, hands still gripping sword hilts tight, but having no chance to swing even once. A few Western soldiers knelt, raising two hands to the sky, signaling surrender. Mouths screaming words of begging in a strange language, but answering them were only cold looks and brutal horse spurs. For the Eastern Army, this war was not to take prisoners, but an eternal deterrent message sent to the Empire across the river. The sound of horse hooves and swords slashing into flesh and bone echoed throughout the desert region all day long, until the sun set once again, leaving tens of thousands of bodies lying scattered like piles of garbage rejected by the desert. When the afternoon wind blew through the red sand dunes, a deadly silence covered the entire basin, replacing the screams and the sound of metal colliding that had lasted for the past 2 days. More than 20,000 bodies of heavy infantry soldiers, once the invincible pride of the Western Empire, scattered everywhere, from high sand dunes to low depressions. Expensive iron armor sets, large red-painted and gold-gilded shields now lay neglected, half buried under the dusty sand layer, becoming soulless scrap amidst the vast desert. The Eastern Army began the work of cleaning up the battlefield, slowly and methodically. The sun torn from the pole, thrown onto the loot carts like broken toys. About 10,000 surviving prisoners, stripped of all weapons and armor, tied in strings, forming long, endless lines, dragging steps towards the east to begin a life of hard labor slavery in a foreign land. Forever, the head of the old commander-in-chief and the highest-ranking generals of the defeated side were carefully preserved, to be sent to the eastern capital, offered to the king as proof of the greatest victory in the kingdom's history. The price to pay for the ambition of invasion was the destruction of 7 elite legions and a generation of elite youth of the Western Empire, wiped out completely in just one battle. News of this defeat quickly flew west like a fierce storm, causing shock to the entire upper echelon of the powerful empire. The fear of armor-piercing horse archers and invincible armored cavalry of the East became a terrifying obsession, forcing the Western Empire to stop the conquest march and accept the border river as an impassable boundary for many centuries after. In the hot desert, dust and sand gradually covered the bones of the defeated, erasing all traces of the slaughter, leaving only the sound of wind whistling through sand dunes like an eternal lament for an arrogant army that was buried.